large-scale mass formation emerges in a society when the population is in a very specific mental condition. And the first and most crucial characteristic of this condition is that many people have to feel disconnected from their natural and social environment. That's the most crucial condition. Many people have to feel lonely, disconnected from their natural and social environment. And that was something that was very clear just before the corona crisis. Worldwide, over 30% of the people worldwide claimed not to have one meaningful relationship and to only connect to other people through the internet. So it was a very strange situation. And the number of people feeling lonely and disconnected was increasing throughout the last few hundred years. And that also explains why throughout the last few hundred years, the mass formation actually became ever stronger. And in the end, the masses became so strong that they could seize control of society and create a new kind of state system, namely the totalitarian state. That was something that was anticipated by Gustave Le Bon in 1895 already. He warned the world then that mass formation became increasingly strong, and he said, if we continue like this, the masses will seize control over society, led by certain leaders. And that was exactly what happened about 20 years later. Gustave Le Bon describes this in his book, The Psychology of the Crowd. So, but indeed, the most crucial precondition for mass formation to emerge on a large scale in a society is always that there is a high number of socially disconnected, isolated people.
Disconnected people, and okay, so that's your first characteristic. When you argue that this became especially prominent as a precondition at the beginning of the 20th century, is this because people were moving away from their natal homes to work? Is it connected to the Industrial Revolution, or what caused that extra disconnection?
It's definitely connected to the Industrial Revolution, definitely, because it's clear, even you can see in two ways that the level of loneliness is connected to the level of industrialization and technology use. If you look at this moment in the world, then you will see that the problem of loneliness is almost perfectly correlated to the level of industrialization and technology use in the world. For instance, in Northern America and Western Europe, you will see that the levels of loneliness are much higher than elsewhere. In the United Kingdom, Theresa May appointed a minister of loneliness in 2017, just because she realized how she acknowledged the number of people who felt lonely. And also in the US surgeon mentioned that there was a loneliness epidemic. So it's generally accepted that the problem is connected to industrialization and technology use. And you also see throughout the ages that as the level of industrialization increases, and as the level of technology use increases, we also see this increase in the number of people who feel lonely. So it's definitely connected to each other. Yes.
Okay. All right. So your first characteristic is the disconnectedness and loneliness of people. What's the second?
Yes. And then from the first one follows the second one, which is that many people have to experience a lack of meaning making in life. But the two are inevitably connected, because as the social bond between people impoverishes or deteriorates, then you will automatically see that people start to be confronted with lack of meaning making. And that's just because people are intrinsically human social animals and social beings, and that they experience meaning every time they see that their existence has an effect on the other. If people notice that their existence has an effect on the other, then they will spontaneously experience meaning and purpose in life. And if this connection, if the social bond deteriorates, then in the same way, the experiences of meaning making will drop away from existence. And people often don't connect the two to each other, but they are connected. Psychologically, they are very strongly connected at the psychological level. Also that if you look at the number of people reporting that they consider their job a bullshit job at the end of somewhere in 2018, there was this Gallup World Poll, which indicated that 60% of the people worldwide considered their job to be a so-called bullshit job, which is only logical, because if people make something, if they produce something with their work, they almost never know the person who will use what they produce, meaning that they never see the effect of their own labor, of their own work on the other. And that's probably one of the reasons why so many people have the experience that their job is a bullshit job.
Yeah, this is a really important fact. And of course, before COVID and before the woke revolution, many had noticed the collapse of our capacity to make meaning, which I also take to be, I mean, there's a lot to discuss and maybe we'll come back to it, but the fact of people largely partnering with other people that they don't grow up with, that they don't know especially well, that our adult lives are interfacing with a lot of people. We may like them, but we don't know them, means that our language is impoverished because we don't know the very precise meaning of a term as somebody else uses it. We just sort of have the general, English version in my case. And so that bluntness of every term we might wish to use means that the highest quality meaning we could possibly make is pretty low, right? It's just a bunch of dull tools in the shed and you can't make a fine piece of furniture with them. But anyway, I interrupted you. So you have disconnection and loneliness as the first characteristics, a failure of meaning making as the second characteristic. What's third?
Yes. As soon as people start to exist in a disconnected state, confronted with lack of meaning making in life, something very specific happens at the affective level. In that condition, people typically start to experience so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means all kinds of negative effects that are not connected to a mental representation. Or in plain terms, just people feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. All their anxiety and negative affectivity is disconnected from the environment and from the mental representations. And that is an extremely aversive mental state, because if you feel, for instance, anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you will typically feel completely out of control, just because you cannot protect yourself from something you don't know. And in the same way, if you feel a lot of frustration and aggression, but you don't know what you feel frustrated and aggressive for, there is no way you can direct your frustration and aggression at something in the outer world. So it remains in yourself. And that it is this condition, this state of disconnectedness, this state of lack of meaning making, all this free-floating negative affectivity, that is if a population is in this mental condition, then it's ready. It's ready for large-scale mass formation. And something, yeah.
Well, so free-floating anxiety, and I know from reading your work that what you mean is that it's not about something concrete. And you point out here that people have a general sense of foreboding, and that is particularly frustrating, let's say, because it doesn't suggest a proper course of action, right?
No, exactly.
And
usually this leads to the development of individual psychological symptoms, like a phobia or one or another obsessional behavior is typically one way in which all this free-floating anxiety can be connected symptomatically to a certain representation. And this allows a subject to have a minimal level of control over its anxiety, because when you feel anxious, but you have no idea what you feel anxious for, you're completely out of control. But if you can symptomatically connect your anxiety to, for instance, a spider or a snake, then you made a huge progress, because in this way you only have to avoid the snakes and the spiders in order to have a minimal control over your anxiety. So very often this state leads to individual symptoms, but sometimes when many people in the population are in this state, it leads to a mass formation which is exactly the same as an individual symptom, but at the collective level. Because what happens in a mass formation is the following. When many people are in this state, with a lot of free-floating anxiety, for instance, if at that moment a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then all this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety, and there might be a huge willingness in the population to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if it is utterly absurd. Because most people even realize that their individual symptoms and their collective behavior is absurd, but it won't take away that they will continue to go along with the narrative as if it is true. And that's what happens in a mass formation. All this free-floating anxiety connects to this object of anxiety. There is this willingness to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, no matter how absurd it is. And in this way, people experience like a first important psychological process or advantage. They will have the feeling that they now can control their anxiety a little bit, and they also anticipate a moment when they can direct all this frustration and aggression at the object of anxiety or at the people that do not want to go along with a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. So that's the first step in every major mass formation in history, every large-scale mass formation. As the first step, is the object of anxiety can be the Jews or the witches or the Muslims or no matter what.
The dirty unvaccinated.
The dirty unvaccinated, yes.
Yeah. That one, it just feels very personal to me because I see it in people's eyes.
Yes.
So anyway, it's a very, very scary phenomenon to witness. All right, we've got disconnectedness and loneliness, meaning failure, free-floating anxiety. All of these are preconditions, and then the fourth.
Yes. Well, the fourth condition is actually the free-floating frustration, and I usually split them in two. The free-floating anxiety is the third condition, and the free-floating frustration and aggression is the fourth condition. Yes, and then because you should distinguish them from each other, actually, because for some people, the anxiety is the most important factor. For other people, the frustration and aggression is the most important factor. But no matter what, it leads to this first important step in the process of mass formation, meaning the coupling or the connection between a certain mental representation of an object of anxiety that is presented through the mass media, and then the participation in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, for instance, the lockdowns to deal with the virus. That's the first step in the process of mass formation. But there is a second step, which is even more important. And it is that because many people participate at the same time in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, people have the feeling of fighting a collective, heroic battle with the object of anxiety. And that makes them feel connected again. It seems to create this new social bond, meaning that in this way, it seems as if the mass formation eliminates the root cause of the problems, namely this lack of connection, this disconnectedness between the human being and its environment. But that's the point. You could say, well, what's the problem? What's the problem? People felt disconnected, and now they feel connected again. They feel reunited. But the problem is that the process of mass formation leads to a very specific social bond. A mass or a crowd is a group that is not formed because individuals connect to each other. A mass is a group that is formed because each individual separately connects to a collective ideal or to the collective, meaning that this solidarity in the masses, which is so typical for the masses, as soon as a mass forms, the masses will typically talk about solidarity and citizenship. But this solidarity is never a solidarity between individuals. It's a solidarity of every individual separately towards a collective. And even more, the longer the mass formation exists, the more the social bonds between the individuals will be destroyed and replaced by a very strong social bond, a very strong solidarity of every individual separately with the collective. And that is what explains why, for instance, in Iran, a mother in the end reports her son, someone with whom she used to have a very strong individual bond, to the state for the sake of the collective. And that also explains why, for instance, in the Corona crisis, everybody was full of solidarity and talking about solidarity. And at the same time, strangely enough, people accepted that if someone got an accident on the street, we were no longer allowed to help that person. Or if we were everybody was talking about solidarity with the elderly, and at the same time, they accepted, strangely enough, that if their father and mother were dying at home, they were no longer allowed to visit them. So that's the strange, destructive mechanism of mass formation, that it sucks all the energy away from the bonds between the people and injects all the energy in the bonds between the individual and the collective, leading in the end always to a radically paranoid atmosphere in which everyone snitches each other, and in which there are, in the end, no relationships anymore between individuals, and individuals are all completely isolated from each other.